Hi, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Jessie Peterson. I'm the Director of Education here at SunRay Construction Solutions. SunRay secures $10 billion annually for GCs, subs, and suppliers. We are a national construction document service. Today's webinar is conducted by the fabulous Jason Robinson, a Wyoming construction law expert. Today's webinar topic is a contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers step-by-step guide to getting paid. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the wonderful Jason Robinson.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Great to be here. Hey, I don't know about wonderful, fabulous, but I am a construction law attorney. I practice construction law in Utah and Wyoming. In Wyoming, I file a lot of liens, I make a lot of bond claims, and I collect a lot of money for a lot of people. So I'm happy, I'm pleased to be here today to help teach, educate the SunRay group about Wyoming lien and bond law and things that you can do to help to protect your money and when you're not paid to get paid. So I'd like to start off here with, as the attorney, of course, you have a disclaimer, right? My disclaimer here for you is that each state has its own unique mechanics, lien, and payment bond laws. Today we'll be talking about Wyoming lien and bond law. If you're doing work in Wyoming, this seminar should be really helpful. If you're doing work in another state, you'll want to refer to SunRay's website or other resources to make certain that you understand that state's law before you perform work there. So I want to start off just letting you know from the outset that you have a lot of tools in your construction collection toolbox, if you will. So these tools are not mutually exclusive. Of course, you have a contract claim. You also have a mechanics lien claim. If it's a public project, you may have a payment bond claim. If it's a private project with a non-statutory payment bond, you may have a payment bond claim there too. What I want to emphasize is that you have all of these tools at your disposal, and you should be ready and able to use these tools. So let's start just briefly with contract claims. You need to make certain that you have some key contract provisions in your contract. The first is make certain that you identify when payment is due. Have an actual due date. Net 30 days is common. I would be really cautious, especially in Wyoming, about contingent payment clauses, pay if paid and pay when paid clauses that provide that a general contractor is not required to pay a subcontractor or supplier until they receive payment from the owner. In some states, those are unenforceable as a matter of law and public policy. That's not the case in Wyoming. And while there isn't any definitive law, I believe that Wyoming courts would most likely enforce pay if paid and pay when paid clauses. So if you have one of those in your contract, strike it if possible. If you can't, and it's a pay if paid, see if you can convert that to a pay when paid clause. Wyoming has no usury law, meaning there is no cap on the amount of interest that can be charged. It's common for material suppliers to charge 18% and even 24%. In Wyoming, in the absence of a stated rate of interest, the statutory contract rate is 7% per annum. And so just know that. And then finally, I just want to mention, I see this all too often, especially in Wyoming for some reason, where a subcontractor, supplier, even a contractor doesn't have a written signed contract, or the contract that is written and signed does not state a rate of interest or have an attorney fee provision in it. And what will happen is they will save that for the billing statement or save that for the invoice. And the fact of the matter is it needs to be agreed to upfront. So if you want to include interest in your contract, if you want to include a provision for attorney fees and costs in your contract, it needs to be in your contract. It's going to be too late if you try to sneak that in after the fact in a billing statement or an invoice. At least typically that's been the case in my experience. So in terms of deadlines on a breach contract claim, in Wyoming, it's 10 years for a written contract, 8 years on an oral contract. This is something else I wanted, as a preface to our discussion on mechanics liens. Beware, if you're signing a contract, especially if you're a general contractor signing a contract with an owner, or I suppose even a sub with a general contractor, watch out for these no lien or preemptive lien waiver clauses that essentially state that you waive your lien rights even before you begin performing work, even before payment is due. you agree up front, you're going to waive your lien rights. You're not going to file a lien on the project. Now in Utah, those are unenforceable as a matter of law. And in a number of states, that's the case, but not in Wyoming. So if you sign a no lien clause as part of your contract up front where you agree not to file a lien, even if you're not paid, there's a pretty good likelihood that would be valid and enforced by a Wyoming court. So if you have that type of clause in your contract, I would strike it. The same with no damage for delay clauses. So let's jump into the second tool. We talked about contracts. The second tool would be a mechanics lien claim. Now, what exactly is a mechanics lien? And the legal definition is it's an involuntary encumbrance against title to real property. But what exactly does that mean? So let me give you an example. If we were to go out and purchase a home, we would obtain a loan from a bank. And the bank would have us sign off on a promissory note. So now we have a mortgage, right? We're paying the monthly mortgage. But as part of loaning this money to us, the bank wants security. And the security the bank gets is a trust deed recorded against title to the home. So that in the event we don't pay the mortgage, we don't make the mortgage payment, the bank can actually come in through that deed of trust that was recorded against title to our property can actually foreclose. And you're familiar with that, where a bank comes in and forecloses on a property, sells the property, and the bank gets paid from the proceeds of the sale. That is a voluntary encumbrance because we need the bank loan, right, to buy the house. And so we're ready and willing to sign off on allowing the bank to record a trust deed against the title to our home, because that's how we're going to buy the home. We need that loan. Well, a mechanics lien is different, right? It's an involuntary encumbrance because the property owner is not agreeing to you, the contractor, subcontractor, supplier, filing a lien against the property. But just like a trust deed provides a bank with a security interest in the property where it's providing the loan, a mechanics lien provides you as a contractor, subcontractor, supplier with a security interest in the property to secure you for payment for the services, labor, materials, equipment that you provide for improvement of that property. And just like a bank can foreclose on a property and be paid from the proceeds of the sale to cover the loan, that the same thing can happen for you as a contractor, subcontractor, supplier. In the event you aren't paid, you can file a lien against the property, and you can go through the process that we'll talk about here today. But generally speaking, by way of overview, you file your lien. If you're not paid, you can file a lawsuit to foreclose the mechanics lien against the property. And ultimately, you can have that property sold at a sheriff's sale to be paid from the proceeds of that sale for the services, labor, materials, equipment that you furnished for the property. And so in essence, the owner can be required to pay twice, for that work. And you know, the question becomes, is that fair, right? From a homeowner's perspective, you know, we just purchased a home. Let's say that we hired a contractor to build a home. And of course, we're good, upstanding citizens, and we pay the general contractor in full. And let's say that the general contractor is great as well, and general contractor pays the subcontractors in full, but a subcontractor fails to pay a supplier, and that supplier files a lien against our property. Well, now we're faced with paying twice, literally paying twice, because we pay the general contractor in full already, right? And is that fair? Is that fair that an owner should have to pay twice? Of course not. That's not fair. But on the other hand, is it fair for a contractor, subcontractor, or supplier to go unpaid? And I think you would all agree that's not fair either. So there's a bit of a conundrum there. And the legislature, the Wyoming legislature, has said, okay, we're going to find that it's better for an owner to pay twice than a contractor, subcontractor, supplier to go unpaid, because the owner holds the purse strings, right? The owner can issue joint two-party checks. The owner can get lien waivers. There are things the owner can do to make certain that the contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers get paid. But as part of that, the legislature said, okay, if we're going to require an owner to potentially pay twice, we are going to make sure that the owner knows who is out on the project so they can issue these joint two-party checks and get lien waivers. So it's really all a matter of communication. And the legislature has said, okay, contractor, subcontractor, supplier, if you want the right to file a lien, you need to communicate. You need to communicate to the owner that you're on the project and that you have lien rights. So we're gonna talk about that. Before we get there, who has the right to file a lien? Well, contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers. And the definition is very, very broad. So if you are furnishing services, labor, materials for a project, whether you're selling or renting, typically you're going to have lien rights. So let's talk about the timing for filing these preliminary notices, because it is unique in Wyoming. For contractors, so if you're the prime contractor, you're required to send your preliminary notice to the project, to the property owner, when? It's before receiving any payment from the owner, including advances. So like any payment at all, you're required to send your preliminary notice to the owner before that date, before receiving any payment or advances. And so that can become a bit tricky, especially if there's an advance of money as part of the deal. And so I would recommend that contractors actually include their preliminary notice in their prime contract with the owner. Just put it in there so it's right there in the contract up front. Make it clear so it's not hidden in the boilerplate or something, but have that preliminary notice in there, maybe as part of the contract package that you hand to the owner of the project, the property owner. And what about subcontractors and suppliers? If you're a subcontractor or a supplier or materialman, you're required to send your preliminary notice to the owner and provide a copy to the general contractor within 30 days after first providing services and material to the project. So you've got 30 days from your first furnishing services, labor, material, equipment to the project. Now, where do you get the information for your preliminary notice? You know, under statute, the contractor is required, the general contractor is required to provide subcontractors and suppliers with the requisite information. Sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't. As a subcontractor or supplier, I would recommend that you ask for that information up front, so you have it available, and then just make certain that you meet that 30-day deadline. Because if you fail to file a preliminary notice, you're not going to have lien rights. Now, in terms of what the preliminary notice looks like, Wyoming actually has a statutory preliminary notice form, and it's available on the Wyoming, you know, it's part of the Wyoming code. And you'll find that Wyoming is its forms are all statutory. Wyoming has a statutory form for pretty much everything relating to liens. And so it becomes fairly easy because you just pull up the form and fill it out. If you have questions about how to access the form, feel free to contact the SunRay folks. Feel free to contact me, and happy to help you with that. So now we have filed our preliminary notice and we still haven't been paid. What do we do next? Well, under Wyoming law, we're actually required to send a notice of intent to lien. So you send that notice of intention to file lien, and again, it's a statutory form, within no later than 20 days before filing your lien statement. So you've got to file your notice of intent to lien at least 20 days before you file a mechanics lien on the project. And if you fail to send a notice of intent to lien, typically you're not going to have lien rights, period, end of story. Now, there are some very, very limited exceptions by case law that we might be able to use to your benefit in the event you fail to send a notice of intent to lien, but I certainly would not rely on that. And again, there is a statutory form for your intent to lien. So now, when are you required to file the lien in the event of non-payment? So now you've sent out your notice of intent to lien. And keep in mind, you've got to account for that 20 days, because if you've got to have the 20 days, plus you've still got to meet these deadlines. So if you wait until the deadline and then send your notice of intent to lien, you're going to be too late. So make sure to give yourself plenty of time. Contractors are required to file their lien within 150 days of the earlier of the date that they last furnished work for the project, or the date of substantial completion of the project. That's a defined term that we're going to talk about in a moment, substantial completion of the project. If you're a subcontractor or supplier, you are required to file your mechanics lien, your lien statement, within 120 days of the earlier of the date when the work for the project was complete, so the last date of work for the project as a whole. And keep in mind, this is the earlier of, or the date of substantial completion of the project, or the date of your last services, labor, materials, or equipment if you were a subcontractor or supplier. So the date of substantial completion, this is kind of interesting, kind of cool, I guess. The general contractor can actually file a notice of substantial completion. And I think I said general contractor. Typically, it's going to be the owner. The owner files a notice of substantial completion with the county recorder's office, and that becomes the date of substantial completion. And it applies to subcontractors and suppliers to whom the owner sends via certified mail, sends a copy of that notice of substantial completion. So if you receive as a subcontractor or supplier the notice of substantial completion, then that becomes the date, the triggering date for filing your mechanics lien. Then again, it's all deadline driven. If you fail to file your lien statement by the deadlines, then it's just going to be too late. And again, there is a statutory form for both a mechanics lien and a notice of completion. So the lien statement, this is a list of what needs to be included in your lien statement. There are a couple of things that are a little different than some states. I just want to point out the fourth bullet point down, you need an itemized statement describing exactly what you furnished. And then a few bullet points down from there, you need actually the last bullet point, you need to actually include a copy of your contract if you have it available, or if you don't have the contract available, then a summary of basically what was contracted to, and then where a person can obtain a copy of the written contract. So there's actually quite a bit of work that goes into preparing a Wyoming lien, and a lot of information that you as a contractor, subcontractor, supplier will need to provide as part of that process. Now, within 30 days of recording your lien, you'll need to send a copy of the lien to the property owner. And it doesn't render your lien void or unenforceable if you fail to send it, at least to the best of my knowledge, my experience. But send it, right? It's all about communication. Communication. Send a copy of the lien. And again, there is a statutory form. It's a notice of filing lien form that you'll send out. So you're required to file a lawsuit for, now we filed the lien, still haven't been paid, you're required to file your lawsuit within 180 days of the date you filed your lien. And if you miss the lien filing deadline, then you have no lien, right? You're just done. And keep in mind that attorney fees are awardable to the prevailing party. So that cuts both ways. You want to make sure that you are prevailing so that you can recover your attorney fees and costs. Just briefly, Wyoming is one of about a dozen states that has a statutory lien waiver form. So again, there are statutory forms. Make sure you use this form. It is an unconditional lien waiver. If you haven't received payment, I would recommend converting that to a conditional lien waiver. When you are paid, you're required to release your lien within 30 days of receiving payment. If you don't, you can be liable for actual damages plus $100 a day, right? So if you get paid, when you get paid, make sure that you get that lien released via the statutory notice of satisfaction of lien form. Typically, your lien is going to really encumber the property where you performed your work. This is kind of cool in Wyoming. You can actually remove property. You can repossess property, materials, equipment that you furnished for a project if you can show a court that doing so would not ruin the project, right? If it would leave the project in essentially the same or similar condition, you can actually repossess. So that's a different situation where typically when you furnish equipment, material, you have lien rights, but you can't take it back. So you typically on a tenant build out situation, your lien would attach to the leasehold interest in the property, not the property itself. Unless in Wyoming, if you can show that the landlord agreed to pay for the cost of the improvement, or that the improvement was specifically authorized by the landlord, which typically you would find in the lease agreement, then you could have a lien against the property itself and not just the lease agreement. You can actually extend the right to file a lien. So if you have a situation where someone's promising payment but you're up against your lien filing deadline, by agreement that gets recorded with the county recorder's office, you can actually extend the time for filing a lien. Lien priority in Wyoming is based on the liens are all on equal footing. If there's not enough money to pay everyone, the money gets shared pro rata. And liens relate back to the first visible work in terms of priority in relation to trust deeds and other encumbrances on the property. Liens can be bonded off in Wyoming, and if someone bonds off your lien, just keep in mind that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, instead of foreclosing on the property, you get money in the bank. You're just going after this bond or cash that's been deposited in a bank account with your name on it. So let's jump now from mechanics liens on private projects to public projects. On a public project, you have no lien rights, but in lieu of lien rights, you may have a payment bond claim. So in Wyoming, for every project where the contract price between the owner and general contractor exceeds $150,000, the owner is required to have the general contractor post a payment bond. You could look at a payment bond kind of like an insurance policy, if you will. So, but it's a bond that you would have a claim against as an unpaid subcontractor or supplier. Now, if the contract price is less than 150 grand, the owner may require some type of security, some type of bond or other security, but is not required to do so. And I would recommend to you at the outset of a project, a public project, ask the question, is there a payment bond, right? Is there a payment bond or some form of guarantee that you can make a claim against? Just find out at the very outset of the project. Maybe have a job sheet that has a box that you check. Is there a bond? And get a copy of the bond up front so that you know what your rights are in the event of non-payment. So who can make a claim against the bond? Again, it's like if you are a subcontractor or supplier furnishing services, labor, material, equipment for a project, typically you will have a claim against that bond in the event of non-payment. And unlike the Miller Act, where there's a remoteness element where you can be too far down the chain to make a claim, that's not the case under the Wyoming law for public project payment bond claims. So here we go. This is a little interesting. So for preliminary notice, if you're a subcontractor or supplier, you're required to send a preliminary notice. Now keep in mind, a general contractor will never make a payment bond claim because it's the general contractor's bond, right? So it's typically going to be subcontractors and suppliers who would make a claim against a payment bond. And by way of preliminary notice, a subcontractor or supplier is required to send a preliminary notice to the general contractor no later than 60 days after the date on which the subcontractor or supplier furnished services, labor, materials, equipment. If, and here's the big if, you're required to send a preliminary notice if, number one, the contract price between the owner and the general exceeds $150,000, which is going to, candidly, that's going to be most projects. And number two, the general contractor posts on the construction site a prominent sign. And in that sign, they cite to the relevant payment bond statute, and they explain in that sign that, hey, you're required, subcontractor, supplier, you're required to give notice of your, a preliminary notice. And if you don't give preliminary notice, then you waive your claim against the payment bond or other guarantee. Now, this becomes interesting because I have not seen many instances where a general contractor posts signage on a job site with this information. But I would suggest from a general contractor's perspective, if you are posting this type of prominent signage, take a picture, right? Take a picture so you can prove down the road that, that you posted the requisite sign. And if you're a subcontractor or supplier, I would advise you to just assume that there is a sign on the project site somewhere, right? Maybe you couldn't find it, but hey, maybe there's a lot of wind in some areas of Wyoming. Maybe the sign was blown over. Maybe you couldn't find the sign because it was at a different area of the job site. Just assume there was a sign and send your 60-day preliminary notice. Okay, so the preliminary notice itself, and there is not a statutory form on this, so you'll need to come up with your own form or have a service like SunRay or someone put the form together for you. But in that form, you're required to provide your name, your contact information, your name, address, phone number, and the name of a contact person, the name and address of the person who owes you the money, your customer, and then the type or description of the materials that you furnished for the project. And if the contract price was over 150 grand between owner and general contractor, and the general contractor posted the requisite signage, and you fail to send a timely, proper preliminary notice, then you're not going to have a claim against the payment bond or other guarantee. So I would say send it, right? Send that preliminary notice. Now the question becomes, we've done the preliminary notice, we still haven't received payment. What's our deadline to file an enforcement action? Okay, you have 1 year from quote unquote final completion of the project to file a lawsuit against the payment bond. Well, what's final completion? Well, in Wyoming, it's kind of cool. In Wyoming, final completion is defined as the date that the public owner posts the date of final completion on their website. So the state actually has a procurement website where you can find this information on the website, or if it were a local entity like a city, county, they also have websites where they should be posting this information. But again, I would say I would be cautious here because there could be a situation where maybe it was posted on the website, but you couldn't find it, or there was a glitch with the website, and now you couldn't find the notice of the final completion. So pick up the phone, call the owner. Hey, have you filed the final completion for this project? When was the date of final completion? So that you can calendar your 1 year, or err on the side of caution and file your lawsuit sooner than later, maybe within 1 year of your last date of work, calendar it that way. And that's it. I know that was like drinking from a fire hose, but that's the gist of some of these collection tools that you have in Wyoming. You have a breach contract claim, you have a mechanics lien claim on a private project, whether it be commercial or residential, and on a public project, you have a payment bond claim, assuming that there is a payment bond or other form of guarantee. So with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. You really are incredible, like I said before, and that was a wonderful webinar, so I appreciate it. As for the questions, we do have a question that came through, and I think you actually touched on it in your presentation, but I'll still pose it for them and just to clarify. Can I still collect the entire unpaid amount from the owner, even if they have paid the GC?
Yes, yeah, the owner can actually be, my understanding is the owner can actually be required to pay twice.
Yes, correct. That's what from my understanding as well. And then the other question that came through is, if there is a tenant, I'm only able to go after the tenant's interest rather than the property unless it can be proven that the property owner agreed or directed the work. Is that correct?
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Yeah, so typically, and this is the case in Utah and other states as well, your lien rights attach to the interest of the person, the project owner, the person who's contracting for the work. And so if it's a tenant who's contracting for performance of the work, your lien rights are typically limited to that tenant's interest in the project property, which is going to be a leasehold interest. That's typically how it goes. But in a lot of states, there are exceptions. So in Wyoming, if you can show that the owner of the land, the landlord agreed to pay for the work. You know, if the landlord said, hey, yep, tenant, you can contract to have this work done, and I as landlord agree to pay for it. If you can show that's the case, then your lien would attach to the owner's fee simple interest in the property, and so it would attach to the dirt itself, to the land. Or if you can show that really it's by lease agreement that the landlord authorized that work to be performed. Now, and let me give you just a quick example here of a scenario that might come up. Let's say that you have a landlord who leases the space to a tenant who the landlord knows is going to use the space as a restaurant. And under the building code, in order for the space to be used as a restaurant, you're required to have an overhead fire suppression system. Well, by virtue of requiring that space be used as a restaurant, the property owner is essentially requiring that this work be done, right? Because the owner knows, oh, okay, for this space to be used as a restaurant, my tenant's going to have to contract to have this overhead fire suppression system installed. That's A. And I think B, from a policy perspective, I think a court would be inclined to allow a lien to then attach to the landlord's interest in the property, because this is the type of improvement that would go even beyond the lease term. So when this business, this restaurant leaves the space, the landlord could likely still benefit from this overhead fire suppression system with its new tenant, whether that be another restaurant or a gym or whatever the case may be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thanks so much for that clarification. I appreciate it. I think that's all the questions that have come in so far. If anyone does have another question that wasn't addressed, please feel free, as always, to reach out to us, and I will be sure to answer your questions as soon as possible. Can you go to the next slide for us, please? All right, who is ready to win a gift? If you are able to answer these questions correctly in our chat, we'll go ahead and send you guys over a free little gift to you as a thank you for participating. When is the deadline to file a preliminary notice in Wyoming for subcontractors and suppliers on a state project? And then when is the deadline to file a preliminary notice in Wyoming for subcontractors and suppliers on a residential or commercial project? Each type of project is going to have a different deadline, so pay attention. If you know the answers, go ahead and chime in for us. All right, go to the next slide, if you will. All right, if you can scan this QR code, you'll get some of our SunRay resources available to you: the deadline calculator, project information sheets, state lien law guides, the lien calculator. There's so much there. Check it out. Make sure that you guys are staying organized, securing your lien rights by following those deadlines. Next slide, if you don't mind. All right, we have our new service, SR Receivables. We will help you with your collections and help get you guys paid. So give us a call, send us an email, and we will be sure to help you out and explain more in detail to you. Next slide, if you don't mind. All right, our next webinar with Jason about the Wyoming lien laws is going to be "Don't sign a release unless it says this one thing." That's going to be Thursday, October 24th. Please go ahead and register for free at sunraynotice.com/education. We'd love to see you guys there. Next slide, if you don't mind. All right, if you can give us a review, we'd love your feedback to always improve our webinars and our services. That would be lovely, and it helps to also get the information out to other contractors and suppliers like you guys. Next slide, if you don't mind. All right, and with that, that is all we have for you guys today. Thank you so much for everyone that attended. We hope to see you at our next webinar. Jason, again, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate all of your time and your knowledge that you're able to impart on us. We hope you all have a wonderful and beautiful sunny day. Thanks again, everyone.